Hi, you're listening to Defend Your Time, brought to you by Ontinue. I'm your host, Chris Taylor. This is the podcast where we help you get stronger security, better value, and fewer headaches out of your Microsoft security investments. Today, I'm joined by Dan Holland, Deputy CISO at Tampa General Health System, and Sam McHugh, Security Strategist at Ontinue. Dan is Deputy CISO for Tampa General Health System, a $4 billion health system with 30,000 physicians and teammates, 150 locations across Florida. Today, Dan and Sam are going to be talking to us about how to get leadership on board with improving security posture at your organization. So that includes everything from getting budget, influencing leaders, quantifying risk. So this is going to be a great discussion. I appreciate Dan and Sam. Thank you both for joining us today. Let's get into it.
Awesome. Thank you. Dan, really enjoy the years we've known each other and obviously the latest development in your new role. You were the first on my list as we're approaching HIMSS to pick your brain on what I already know is in there. But maybe just before we get into those specific topics, tell me about the role and what drew you to that. What specific challenges are you tackling over there?
Yep, I've been with TGH for just a few months in this capacity. I was with them for about 6 months as a consultant beforehand, putting a plan together and working through the budgetary process. And in my experience as a consultant running my own company, I never had the kind of engagement from a cultural standpoint and also more tangibly as what I was experiencing at TGH when they offered me the deputy CISO role to actually implement the plan that we had put together and got approved. I took the opportunity and haven't looked back. I've been building out the team. I've hired 8 people in the past 7 months, and we're really focused on enabling the business as it continues to grow, because TGH has grown. The top line revenue that Chris was talking about has grown 42% over the past 3.5 years, organically and through acquisition. And there's no sign of that slowing down. So we're really focused on putting a strong foundation in place for that growth.
Where do you guys feel you are in the curve? Where do you feel like as we come to HIMSS and where people are in the healthcare system in understanding risk and threat landscape and things like that?
TGH is post-breach. There was a substantial breach in 2023. And since then, the organization has tripled its investment in cybersecurity. And we've grown out the team, as I mentioned. As far as where TGH is at the curve, I think we're pretty far to the right. We've also got some peer benchmarking, other results that confirm that amongst our peers in the healthcare provider space, we are towards the more advanced end with a security scorecard of 95, BitSight 750. Those are some of the metrics that we use to peer review ourselves, as well as purple team results from vendors that come in and give us that peer benchmark analysis. So there's that. There's also the high trust R2 certification that we maintain that gives us some of that external validation and assurance about where we're at from a security standpoint.
Excellent. And when it comes to that response or that sort of company-wide sense of priority, I was at our sort of company kickoff and we invited a CIO of a longtime client who shared the journey to us as their security partner. And he shared that the overreaction after the breach, all of a sudden people went out and bought duplicate and triplicate of tools, and it was like an overreaction, and then they didn't figure out what the plan was. How do you see the attention and then what to do with it intelligently so that obviously a year from now, you're not retracting or having to answer to maybe moving too fast or moving in the wrong order?
Yeah, I think you're speaking to a few different things there, right? It's a process more than anything else. It also, requires strong governance and great communication. A lot of those things that are tough to measure and implement in the wrong environment. And that's where some of these methodologies that we're going to talk about, risk quantification, certainly come in. But from a leadership standpoint, from a governance standpoint, just from a business planning standpoint, being very crisp and clear about what we intended to do and having Gantt charts to show the timeline, breaking down the budget request to the line item of what we were going to use those resources for was how we presented the plan to leadership and were able to defend it. What we have not gotten to yet and what we are looking to go to in order to defend those investments, because my boss looks at it as a loan. He doesn't think that this budget that's tripled over the past few years is ours forever, right? It's something that we have to earn every single day. And that requires that communication, that constant improvement, the seeking out operational efficiencies as we're going through, and shelfware we're absolutely allergic to. Nobody's got the resources to be able to afford tools that are sitting unused on the shelf. So that's something that we aggressively seek out.
It truly is an investment, right? So what to you is the way you're articulating to maybe even non-technical people the payoff, like even just focus on data classification. There's a lot of work that goes into that so that the complicated nature of handling the data once it's in the proper order, proper labels, people not pushing stuff where they shouldn't. You're buying this cleanup in a way that will take some effort and some owners and stakeholders that kind of then tend to it afterwards.
Absolutely. I think the foundation is that we are enabling business processes, right? We have to really understand how the organization, how TGH delivers value, both in a clinical and non-clinical setting. Chris mentioned in the intro that we're actually an academic health system. So we've got the education and the research missions as well as being a healthcare provider. But when we understand how the organization is delivering value across those different mission sets, and we understand how the information systems support and enable those business processes, then we can come up with and collaborate with those stakeholders on in a complementary fashion so that we're not inhibiting that value generation, but securing it. And that's our mission, is to secure that deliverance of value. Uh, Data classification, data governance is an example that really lends itself well to quantified methods of risk analysis, because by reducing the attack surface by X%, we can calculate what the loss magnitude has been reduced by in the event of a data breach, right? Because there's that many fewer records that would be exposed, and we can do the math on the per record basis of how much risk we're facing. And then when you multiply that loss magnitude by the probability of how we assess how vulnerable we are to those types of attacks, depending on the scenario, right? We're able to come up with the annual loss expectancy. And then by applying controls, we can calculate, and this is, I think, the key metric for security leaders to work towards, is the return on risk mitigation. Return on risk mitigation allows us to quantify the impact of different control groups. Control group A is going to mitigate $2 million based on this analysis. Control group B is going to mitigate $5 million based on this analysis. We should prioritize control group B, other context in that decision notwithstanding.
Does that lend also a flexibility of inevitable change? People approach us and they say, oh, we have to be compliant with high trust or cyber insurance or whatever. And I said, well, guess what? In 2 years, there's going to be 3 more things on that list. Are you looking down the road, being positioned to more easily stay ahead of those or predict those? Like, how does that look?
Absolutely. I think that's pointing to something that I've seen a lot in my career as a consultant, where assessments are treated as point in time projects or efforts, right? So it'll be an annual NIST CSF assessment that would come out and conduct, and then a year later come out and it's the same findings all over again because nobody acted on or made any decisions based on the findings last time. By prioritizing the risks, we're able to clarify those mitigation paths and get buy-in. If I tell you that I need $1 million to mitigate a risk, and this will take us from a 3.5 to a 4, and you're an executive leader, right? And you've got a lot of domains of risk you're responsible for, not just cyber risk, right? We tend to be myopically focused in our world, but we're one of many domains of risk. And I say I need that $1 million investment to go from a 3.5 to a 4, or take this high risk to a moderate risk, or red to yellow, whatever those ordinal values are that are on the heat maps that we're so used to in the space. A much better way to present that information and that decision to the decision makers that actually own the risk is that $1 million investment is going to mitigate $4 million of risk off the annual loss expectancy that we assessed. Is that a return on risk mitigation that you want to support? Should we look for alternatives, compensating controls? Are we looking for higher return on risk? There's different ratios that we can work towards, and set baselines through governance, but just that decision-making process of having a structured way to look at these things that actually translate to business terms is half the battle. Because they're never going to understand when we start talking about threats and vulnerabilities. They want to know what our risks are and are we on top of them and what are we going to do to get on top of them to bring that risk down to an acceptable level. That points to something else that I've almost never seen clearly documented, which is statements of risk tolerance. What is an acceptable level of risk for our organization? And what are we doing to maintain our risk profile within that limit that we shall not exceed? And it's circumstantial, right? When we're driving down the road on the I-75 here in Florida with a speed limit 70, if it's sunny and clear and there's no other cars on the road, don't see any police, your individual risk tolerance and based on a number of factors, if you're speeding to pick up your kid at school, you might have a higher risk tolerance in that circumstance and be willing to go faster than that 70 miles an hour speed limit says you should go because your tolerance exceeds that limit that's set by the regulatory body, right? And that's okay because you've got an exception process that you're comfortable with in your own head. At an organizational level, an enterprise level, we just need to document that and structure it and build it into our processes so that every assessment goes through that same lens to enable a consistent decision-making process.
So what is the common language that you can speak? And maybe my second question out of that is, who helps define the path? What's a path that organizations are having to grapple with between I would like my dedicated people, and then also I know I need some outside experts?
Having partners that you can trust is necessary because nobody has the resources or the internal W-2 headcount to have expertise in every role in every domain that we need it in. So we absolutely partner externally, and being clear about what it is that we are going to outsource and trust a partner with, what processes we're comfortable with that partner handling for us. Critical processes that are absolutely essential to us are not off the table. But having a strategy, having an intent, and then adapting as you go through time, right? There's cycles and pendulums that swing about insource versus outsource, hiring freezes, budgetary constraints. Everybody has to deal with those things throughout time. But I think that having that, it goes back to governance, right? Getting the right stakeholders involved and making sure that you're communicating clearly so that they can make good informed decisions is that foundation that I think you're pointing towards. And if we need more resources because certain controls aren't being applied appropriately and they're absolutely necessary and even required by you mentioned some of the regulatory requirements that we face, that has to be communicated loudly and clearly by us. And that's our job. We have to be champions of those security measures that we understand and know are most valuable and fight for the resources to apply them.
No, excellent. It's always a fight, right? Risk mitigation even is in the form of, I'm going to go and ask for something and I hope I get a yes. But how about the consensus internally, right? Like obviously security shouldn't be alone and be siloed. So when you're looking at this, maybe with infrastructure, what teams did you know needed to be on the same page if this was actually going to work?
Understood. I think that, and maybe what you were asking on the previous question was in reference to the division of responsibilities and duties. Are you familiar with the 3 lines of defense model by the Institute of Internal Auditors? If not, I can give a quick summary of it.
Yeah, please do.
So it's a model for organizational assurance, providing that to the board, but also to management. If you picture 3 lines of defense, you've got the 3rd line, which is internal audit. They're reporting directly to the board, the governing body, and independently reporting on the performance of management across a variety of functions. Management has 1st and 2nd line. They report to the governing body as well, of course. The CEO, being the manager of the organization, reports to the governing body, but they have 1st and 2nd line reporting to them. The 2nd line is where governance, risk management, compliance teams sit, right? That's supposed to be an independent body, not control owners, that are working closely with the 1st line to assess, prioritize, apply controls, follow up, and work to strengthen and apply management's intent, right? That independence in the 2nd line of defense is key to our ability to conduct those assessments. You don't want the wolf watching the hen house and saying, conducting self-assessments, saying, yes, I do this. Yes, this is encrypted. Yes, this is backed up. You need somebody independent going and saying, show me the evidence. Otherwise, you get a much lower level of assurance out of that assessment activity. A third party coming in and doing that assessment work is how many organizations approach that, because that independence and the separation of duties is so key.
Where does some of the philosophy or opinions start to come in? And I'm going to even focus it towards like tooling, for instance. There are companies out there with brands and Super Bowl ads that this is the best in the top corner of this, and this is the best versus maybe a platform or again, like infrastructure might be in love with Palo Alto firewalls. What is the approach to actually put these things together and have them work?
So we talked about the return on risk mitigation, right? From a prioritization standpoint, what will making this investment do to our risk profile? But that's one dimensional, right? There's the operational efficiencies gained by consolidating with a platform versus maybe a higher level of control efficacy by going with best of breed. I wish I had a better answer for you other than we get the stakeholders on a Teams call and we talk through it. When we say, okay, who's going to be responsible for what? What do we currently have? What are the capabilities that we would gain from this? And let's put a plan together if it's something we want to move forward and route it up through the leadership team. We've got our annual budget cycle, but those conversations are happening all the time where we're meeting with vendors, exploring what the cutting edge is going to be, attending conferences and meeting new people and learning new things. And that's a huge part of the role. Maybe one of my favorite parts too, because I love to see what's the cutting edge, and we're heavily involved in AI tools and AI governance. There's a lot of potential and a lot of uses that we're already implementing across TGH for those kind of technologies.
From a operational component, how do you manage that? Because obviously the tools have to work together. TGH is not only a 24/7 operation. Sick people don't stop coming if there's a hurricane. So how have you positioned those business continuity realities with the fact that anything could happen at any time and usually isn't meant to ever be convenient?
Our geographic location definitely puts an emphasis on BCDR planning. I'll say that. It's something that we have extra considerations, right? And again, cyber risk is just one domain of risk that has to be factored into those larger business continuity discussions and situations. So having system redundancy and actually testing those systems and regularly validating that the controls and backups that we think are in place are actually in place is, again, a process level function that a team is responsible for doing, and there's accountability for their performance along those lines. And then the second line of defense is working with them. The third line of defense is looking over everybody else's shoulder and making sure that we are prioritizing and implementing the things to the degree that leadership expects us to, right? Back to the risk tolerance. Are we within that limit that the senior leaders have set for us? Because something else that I've seen along the way on the journey is a lot of uncertainty at the system level. When you do an assessment, there are some findings that the security team doesn't like, but the business still wants to move forward with it. So there's this give and take back and forth. Is this okay? Is this not okay? We really don't have well-defined standards to assess against, and we don't know what our risk tolerance is. So is this okay or not? And that just grinds the business to a halt. And that's what the business wants from us as a security team. One, to keep them safe, maintain the CIA triad for sure, but also do it in a timely manner because we've got stuff to do. And waiting for security is probably the number one complaint every organization has about security, is that I'm waiting for security to make a decision. And when leadership provides clear guardrails to operate within from a governance standpoint, it makes everything go so much faster.
If someone's not, as I'm using air quotes, as lucky as you to have a good crisis to remind people that there's a priority, what are areas that be low-hanging fruit that can be worked on to start garnering that attention that's probably pretty common if someone feels like they need to get on with this modernization, maybe bringing the company up to speed or the organization?
I think that's a great question, right? That's something that I would hope security professionals are vetting in advance with their potential employers when you're considering joining a new organization, right? How much support do I have here? What do you expect from us? Do you have a good does the leadership team have a good understanding of what our risks are and what our plan is, what our approach is? If there's not that fundamental understanding, then I think one of the first things we did was document a strategy and establish cyber governance and start communicating. How to get to things like risk tolerance, we put surveys out in front of them and talk through different scenarios. Okay, this AI-enabled system was brought in through imaging, and it's going to generate $10 million of cost savings by streamlining the patient scheduling process. But there's some security vulnerabilities, and they were assessed at $5 million of annual loss expectancy. But it's going to generate $10 million of revenue. Is this an acceptable system? Do you want it to move forward or not? What if the ALE was $1 million? What if it was $500,000? So that's how to introduce some of these concepts that have worked well for us, where the leadership team isn't used to seeing terms like annual loss expectancy, and they're used to seeing red or 4.5 out of 5 or whatever the risk taxonomy that's being used has historically been used. And if they want to move away from that and adopt a quantified approach, that may help them make better decisions. So security leaders that are coming into those new situations first need to define what direction they want to take it based on their assessment of the priorities, but you can also defend those assessments and those priorities with a model like FAIR, right? That translates it to business terminology.
Yeah, and everybody seems to be yearning for a common language, and it feels like things are developing. You turned me onto that, and it's very intriguing because with our Microsoft focus, secure score, compliance score, those become at least common and comparable metrics. And it feels a godsend because most people either made it up and just compared their subs or sister orgs, but now it has a feeling that you're catching up to your peers, or you're essentially creating a bar to either say we're behind this, or we're on pace, or we're exceeding it. The outside help definitely feels like the biggest concern, right? There's so many people purporting to have this expertise, or could do that, or can do this. What would you look to someone looking at threats, or someone helping you with XYZ? Like, how do I cut through all the noise, and what are some of the bona fides or questions that I should be asking beforehand if I'm going with the right sort of Sherpa, as opposed to someone I'm going to regret in a year?
That's a risk. That's a risk of doing business, right? That you're going to get burned sometimes. The best laid plans of mice and men, right? But I'd like to flip that around and ask you a question, if I may. And that would be how you're focused, or how you're choosing your focus areas and domains. Because what you're seeing looking across many clients in the healthcare space can be very informative for us as a trusted partner. I do look for, we've got our peer networks, of course, we've got our ISACs, we've got our opportunities to engage, and we certainly do communicate. In healthcare, it's very collaborative amongst the security teams. HHS working groups were involved in contributing to those, but timing, of course, from our perspective, right? It has to, the timing, we're talking about prioritization and the things we want to accomplish. When somebody knocks on the door that does that thing, that's good timing for you, right? If you'd asked me 6 months ago or 6 months from now, the timing's not good. But how are you all defining or limiting your scope, perhaps, so that you're not saying, hey, I can, because when somebody comes in and says, I can do everything for you, just tell me what your problems are and I'll be your one-stop shop, that's a huge red flag. But the alternative, if you make it too narrow, you could miss opportunities where you could be a valuable partner.
We have the quest for growth or revenue, which used to be, let's start another line of business, let's do another thing, or that is the enemy of effectiveness. Here, I'm lucky enough to articulate things that at least aren't ambiguous, right? We only use a certain set of tools to do the approach that we picked. So if someone says they have CrowdStrike or Carbon Black or another tools, we end the meeting early and we wish them well because we have picked one thing to be good at. And we actually challenge people to be like, if you're comparing us to someone else, ask them, hey, you do this or do this other thing, because a lot of people are starting to realize if you start to be good at everything, you're going to pretty much stink at everything. It was bold, but again, it's unambiguous. People will realize if I own what Ontinue cares about, I don't care if they have competencies in other tools. That means nothing to me. That would only divide their expertise. So now I have
Exactly.
someone completely leaning in the same direction, and we don't waste time with meetings because if someone's not a fit, they're not a fit. Likewise, healthcare specifically is one of three verticals we really heavily focus in: manufacturing, financial services, and healthcare, for two reasons. One, the complexity is there that not everybody can do it, and they'll be outed pretty quickly. And then we get to have less people who kind of claim that they can take this on, and it gives us more to show the value. There's obviously a cost of us providing this service, right? You have to say, I'm going to spend this 250K with Ontinue each year instead of using it for something else. If it's somebody who turns off the lights at 5, then we wouldn't blame them if they went with a low cost local provider. So we try to not be everything to everybody, and that allows us to dig deeper in getting into healthcare compliance. We went through the process of being HIPAA certified. We went through all these things that maybe other stretched organizations would be like, it's not on the roadmap. It allows us to lean in and punch above our weight, right? We are one of the top 10 MDR providers in the world, and we're probably, by employee size, we might be the smallest of those 10, but we focus in one thing. And the best line I heard was a peer of yours at another large hospital was like, I need a partner who understands my pain, right? I can't tell them what's important. They have to know it and even drive us to understand what we need to do to figure it. The partner should be pushing us to do things, not us pushing the partner to do something more than just onboarding us and then we just threaten to fire them.
Said Sam, I applaud that approach, being on the other side of the table where that focus gives you depth in that expertise that we rely on, right? Where you go broad and it's not there anymore. And what's the value? And again, back to that $250,000, I think that lends itself really well to when it gets down to brass tacks about which path are we going to take here, because you all have economies of scale that I think are very valuable. And that $250,000 to get that same level of risk mitigation would cost me quite a bit more to build it out internally, hiring the folks, training them, maintaining just the people, let alone the tooling that goes with it. I think that there's a total cost of ownership that factors in once we identified which path we want to pursue. That's really lends itself. And obviously, you've been successful pursuing that too, being one of the top 10 MDRs. I didn't realize that. So, congrats on that growth.
Yeah, at the onset, picking one lane felt pretty bold, but what emboldened me was seeing people come from other much larger places that branded themselves as being capable, but never being in a position to actually make it happen. So that to me was a strong validator that people who wanted to offer that actually came here because we were essentially built ourselves to do that and stick with it. But the other thing too is what I like is that we're renewing customers because we agree on the need for metrics to be the sign that we're delivering on agreed success, not because we hoard their data and they're like almost dared to start over. So I think that's another thing I would say. We're trying to get the word out. Microsoft allows us to use a tool called Lighthouse, which essentially leaves the data in the client's tenant and we just peer in. So they can turn off the connection as easy as they turned it on. And so we have to show hours saved from an internal team. We have to show posture improvement. We have to show risk mitigation. Otherwise, there's no clear reason that they would be stuck with us. And I do like that at the onset of a sale to say, we can gladly get you on with a peer to back up what I'm purporting. So I'm glad those peer groups exist, and having them be within a vertical also is meaningful, not just any CISO talking to another CISO per se.
Absolutely. Certainly find value in speaking with CISOs in other verticals, especially those like financial services that tend to be more mature and advanced than the healthcare peer group. And we definitely gained a lot from those partnerships as well. But yeah, there's some camaraderie amongst the healthcare cyber folks as well and it is just a great group of folks across the industry, all here for the right reasons, and definitely have enjoyed getting into this vertical. Obviously, you all are focused in it as well, so you agree.
We can't wait to be at HIMSS. Even focusing our where we're going to tell this message is easier than going to some huge IT conference where it's hard to pinpoint like the specific concerns. And again, tailoring it so someone feels like they're getting 100% of what they're paying for is important to us, right? Like you don't want someone like, so for instance, actually, we say healthcare, but our clients are hospital systems. We have 2 medical device manufacturers. We have organizations with data that goes to the payers. I mean, they don't want to be pigeonholed. So it's okay, how will you treat me like who I am as an organization versus TGH for another hospital? Those are really still different things, right? So I appreciate all your insight. It's really good to see what are the fundamental things that need to be tackled that an outside service provider can attach them to for mutual success. Really appreciate your time today, Daniel, and hopefully we continue this conversation in subsequent podcasts or whatever forums we can find.
It'd be my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Defend Your Time, and special thanks to Dan Holland, Deputy CISO from Tampa General Health System, and Sam McHugh. Thank you again for listening. If you like this podcast, please drop us a review on whatever your podcast service is. It helps us reach a broader audience. And stay tuned for more episodes.